So welcome to the Lesson Community College Cultural Anthropology class lecture, and the topic is marriage, and my name is Colleen Baker. So the topic is, what is marriage? And the idea is that marriage is a socially or culturally recognized bond between two or more individuals, and it's developed by humans. It's a cultural institution. And this is something that's relatively new. So Homo sapiens have been around for about 250,000 years, and marriage is a very recent concept. So, you might think the last 8,000 years or since the time of agriculture. And what it really does is it regulates sexual relationships. So who's allowed to have sex with whom? And it determines also economic responsibilities. So who is responsible for which people in society? So it might be an economic responsibility just amongst two people, but then who is responsible for taking care of the children? So that's financial responsibility for the children. It might also be responsibility for who's responsible for taking care of the elderly. So if you think of it in an East Asian culture, in general, once a woman gets married to her husband, she is then responsible not only for her husband and her children, but also to take care of his parents when they become elderly. In addition to those, it talks about rights and responsibilities to each person in the marriage and to family members if applicable. And it's usually arranged by groups or by families. So in the United States, we have this idea of individuals. Each individual can pick whichever person they want to get married to. But in most of the cultures of the world, that's not the way that it happens. Oftentimes it's an arranged marriage, and arranged marriages might play out as children are selected by their parents to become married. And in India, child marriage is common, where two children of relatively the same age get married, but they don't consummate their marriage until they're teenagers. In other societies, it might be a younger lady, somebody who's not mature, sometimes as young as 8 years old or so, is married to an older man, usually somebody that is closer to her father's age. But it might also be an arranged marriage between adult children, and the family members decide what would be a good match for that person. One thing that I found really interesting is now you might have seen the television show. It's called Married at First Sight, and people in the United States who are adults are actually seeking to be on this television show because it's a scientifically based study where sociologists, psychologists, marriage counselors, ministers actually do psychological profiles on people and match them based upon how they think they would work together. So it's sort of like matchmaking with science base. I like that way of arranged marriages. It determines who is responsible for children after the marriage, and it also talks about inheritance. And this is actually the reason why marriage was instituted in Mesopotamia, which was to determine who and how inheritance would be passed down. So all societies have marriage rules, and the one marriage rule is determining who you should marry and who you should not marry. The one thing that seems to be universal is that in the vast majority of societies there's incest taboos. So you shouldn't marry somebody within your immediate family members. So you shouldn't marry your brother or your sister. You shouldn't marry your father or your mother. This sometimes goes as far as you shouldn't marry your uncle or your aunt or your cousins. Fun fact, in California, marrying your first cousin is legal, so you could do that if you chose to. But in general, most people don't select to do that. The idea here is that we should marry either people that are endogamous to us, so people that are like us, people that are the same religion, people that have the same cultural heritage, people who are from maybe the same region in the country. It could also be people that are the same socioeconomic class. Or we should marry outside of our class or outside of our region or outside of our area. And usually exogamous, that means outside. Usually those are smaller societies, and if you have your society is too small, then you could get inbreeding, so then the choice would be to marry outside of that. Something that's happening today, you might have remembered the Zoroastrian Zoroastrian religion. And that's a religion where children, to become Zoroastrian, need to have both their parents need to be Zoroastrians. But Zoroastrianism does not accept converts. So if you are not born into the religion, then you can't become the religion. Well, what's happening is there's only around 200,000 Zoroastrians today. And the younger generation is trying to appeal to the church and to the elders to open up and let them marry exogamous, so marry outside of the church and allow that person to convert to Zoroastrian, because they're saying, if I can't marry outside of the church, really my only choices are my cousins, and I'm not quite interested in marrying my cousins, so Zoroastrianism is going to die out unless you let us marry outside the church and have our spouses convert. Now, there are lots of different types of marriages, and in the United States, the predominant marriage is a monogamous relationship where one man marries one woman, or there's also homosexual relationships, so maybe two men marry each other or two women marry each other. But that's not always the case. There's also polygamy or plural marriage, and that's just having more than one spouse at a time. So you might have seen, like, I think the TV show is Sister Wives or Big Love, where it's one man is married to 3 or 4 different women. In the United States, the government does not recognize plural marriage, so they only recognize the first marriage as the legal marriage, and then the other marriages might be spiritual marriages. But if it comes time to divorce, the only person that can actually get divorced is the first wife or the first husband. There's sororal polygamy, and polygyny, and that is the marriage where one man marries 2 or 3 sisters. So it's not just marrying 2 or 3 women, but specifically sisters. There's polyandry, and polyandry is where one woman marries 2 or 3 or 4 men. And fraternal polyandry is the most common form of this, and that's where one woman marries 2 or 3 or 4 brothers. This is common in Tibet, and the reason for this is because it's a very isolated region, at least until recently, and what happens is the land is not super fertile, so you can't grow a lot of crops. Well, if one man marries 2 or 3 women in a polygamous relationship, he can have, let's say he's married to 3 women, he can have 3 children every year, and let's say the women are fertile for 10 years, he could have 30 children. If it's polyandry, so one woman is married to 3 men, regardless of how many men she's with, she can only have 1 baby per year. So in a 10-year time period, she could have 10 children, whereas the man who's married to 3 women could have 30 children. So it's a way of birth control. And then there's group marriage, and that might be, a variety of individuals are married to each other. So take a minute or two and think about which is the best form of marriage and which is the worst form of marriage, and why. The American Anthropological Society put out a statement to the United States in 2004. And what they were studying is they were trying to determine is specifically homosexual marriage, but they were also looking at polygamous marriages, fraternal polyandry, polygamy with one man and 3 women, all of that type of things. And they were trying to determine, is plural marriage or is homosexual marriage detrimental to society? And what they came out with their statement pretty much says that after studying all of this for about a century of research, and they're studying different civilizations and they're studying different time periods, pretty much they don't say anything about exclusivity of heterosexual institutions. They don't say that that's any better than any other type of marriage. And they did decide that there are a vast array of family types, including families based on same-sex partners, and it doesn't seem like any of this is detrimental to society. I'd like to thank you very much for watching this video, and once again, it's for Cultural Anthropology, and the topic was marriage types.